On Wednesday, something unprecedented is going to happen. For the first time ever, Russia's Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping of China, and North Korea's Kim Jong-un are going to publicly share the same stage. Why are they meeting, and what does it mean for the West? That's what we're going to discuss on this episode of Newscast. Hello, it's James in Glasgow.
And it's James in London.
And we're joined by Sophie Gaston, who is a research fellow at King's College, London. Hello, Sophie.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. It's always nice to speak to you. Now, I'm going to start by describing a picture to you, badly, I would suggest. This picture shows Russia's Vladimir Putin and President Xi Jinping of China sitting around a very, very large circular table. They're quite a long way from each other. There are a lot of brightly coloured flowers and I think some sweetmeats that they've been given in front of them, although I can't see either of those gentlemen eating them. There are bananas and apples and oranges, and behind them a very, very large painting of some form, some sort of Chinese art, which has a bit of water and some sort of pagoda and lovely trees and grass. Is that enough? Has anyone had enough yet?
I'm getting the picture.
Well, that's good. So what's going on in this picture, but more widely with these meetings? And what's the significance? What's happening?
I think that what we're seeing here is we're not seeing, the sort of the Russian equivalent where you can measure the proximity of the leader to President Putin as how close they are. And, sort of, are they at the one end of the table, which means they're being kept at one distance, or are they right next door to each other? I think this is just the Chinese way of doing things. What's been noticeable about all the Chinese diplomacy of this week is it's been reasonably pitch perfect. They've had whenever each leader's turned up, there's been a little bit of cultural sort of a music and a show or some dancing or something that is culturally appropriate to that leader. There's none of that sort of nervousness that you get with foreign leaders when they visit the White House these days, where they don't know quite what's going to happen in the Oval Office. A lot of this has been very straightforward. People have been given a very clear sort of welcome. But if you look at some of the imagery, you can infer a little bit from the body language, and most of that body language shows that President Xi is in charge and everybody else is a supplicant or subordinate.
Yeah, and Sophia, Vladimir Putin is not the only world leader who's been in China in the past few days because, as James sort of hints at there, China's been hosting this thing called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. And there are leaders of more than 20 non-Western states there. And perhaps most interestingly, tomorrow, we're going to have Mr. Putin and Kim Jong-un of North Korea standing shoulder to shoulder with President Xi in Beijing at this military parade marking 80 years since the end of the Second World War. Feels like quite a moment, this.
Yeah, so this is a huge diplomatic coup for Xi Jinping. It's really a whole week of activities with all these world leaders descending on Beijing. We just had also Prime Minister Modi from India as well, making his first trip in some years to Beijing. And of course, we've got President Putin there. And as you said, Kim Jong-un has been in his armored train. He, of course, doesn't fly on his way to Beijing and has apparently arrived there now. Tomorrow there'll be the first meeting of Putin, Kim Jong-un and President Xi ever. The first kind of convergence of these three leaders in the same place, which is extraordinary. But as you mentioned, this Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which doesn't really roll off the tongue, was quite an obscure forum, and certainly that format has been besieged by all sorts of problems over the years. All the discord between these various leaders has not always made it the most productive of settings, but certainly in the current environment, with the geopolitical situation as it is and the choices that Washington are making, there are some opportunities for Xi Jinping, and he has absolutely seized them.
Yeah, we'll come on to that. But just quickly, to stay on the summit, Sophia, did anything happen at it? Anything newsworthy, anything significant? Or is it more the event, the significance is the event?
The significance is the event. The significance is the leaders who show up. The really important thing was that meeting between President Xi and Modi, India and China have not been the closest bedfellows. They have had territorial disputes which actually descended into violent conflict not too long ago. India has certainly actually become quite hawkish on many aspects of its relationship with China over recent years, and has been getting closer and closer to the West, which is something that we, Britain, in the United States, in France, other allies had been actively pursuing. So we were trying to move India away from a position of non-alignment, move it away from its dependency on Russian arms and so on, and bring it a bit more into the Western sphere of influence. What we've seen here is Modi actually taking a more transactional approach. And it's hard not to think that this is in some way prompted by the choices that have been made by Donald Trump.
Yeah, James, it really is interesting for loads of our lifetime, there's been this tussle between autocracy and democracy. I mean, India's a democracy, to be fair, but in terms of China, North Korea, and increasingly Russia, what's going on here? And if you're sitting watching this in Washington, are you worried about what you're seeing?
I imagine it depends which bit of Washington you're sitting in.
Sure, exactly.
If you're in the White House, you might be sort of rather blasé about it and not caring that much. In other parts of Washington, I imagine you would be deeply concerned by the diplomatic self-harm, because you're seeing, many analysts would suggest, the fruits of American diplomacy, the harsh tariffs, as Sophia said, pushing India into the warm embrace of China. This was not the strategy. In Washington, the obsession is China, China, China. They want the Ukraine war out of the way so they can focus on China. And you've got the world's biggest democracy, standing shoulder to shoulder, with your opponents. So I think there'll be a lot of concern in Washington about this. Look, before we get too worked up about this, we have been talking a long time now about the fragmentation of the post-war Second World War order, and American isolationism, and the potential rise of China. And that there's a trend there, and we're just seeing the latest fruits of it. But I think the sort of the comfort that we can get from this is that, as Sophia suggested, this organisation, is not a united body with a coherent executive that is making key decisions. Xi wants it to be. Xi spoke this week of saying there should be greater, the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation should have greater sort of economic influence. It should have a structure for making economic development decisions, instead of it just being a kind of, talking shop. But if you think about it, a lot of these countries, they are at odds with one another. They are not all in agreement with things.
Yeah,
there are a lot of countries sort of in the former Soviet world, the Stans and others, who in recent years and months have been slightly distancing themselves from Moscow. Particularly, we've seen that in the Armenia-Azerbaijan tensions. And so I think that, the idea that this is some great new united body ready to take on the West, I think is perhaps going too far.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way that you can compare this organisation to NATO, for example.
No.
Yeah. Sophia, what do you think about Vladimir Putin's role in all of this and motivation? A country still at war, having invaded Ukraine. What does he want? What is he trying to achieve here?
Well, Putin and the whole of Russia has really been made an international pariah by its invasion of Ukraine. It wasn't just the core Western countries that initially came out in that UN vote and condemned that action. There was a much wider disdain across the global community. So the objective here is obvious for him, is to make inroads for economic engagement, diplomatic engagement that reaches around the views of the West, which are absolutely hardened towards Russia. So, he's shoring up his economic future. Russia has become extremely economically dependent on China, which has been its patron throughout this war against Ukraine. It's also true, and I think the point that James made around the efficacy of these forums like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, this is part of a dual-edged strategy that Xi Jinping has been promoting, which is to pursue influence within existing international institutions like the World Trade Organization, UN, and so on, that were created by the West, but also at the same time create these other forums and try and create a sort of collection of countries that may not share all the same views about different issues and may not always have their interests aligned, but they do have one common interest, which is disrupting, dislodging, or dismantling the supremacy of that Western-led international order. And I think what's been so alarming to countries like Britain over the last few months is that, this order that they're trying to disrupt was underpinned by US hegemony. It was America's dominance in economic markets and security provision, which really kind of upheld the West's capacity to continue this order that we created, 80 years ago. What is happening now is this shift towards a more multipolar world, which has been a longer-term trend. It was something that previously in Washington they were fighting against. What's actually happened is that Donald Trump appears to be comfortable with the concept of a multipolar order. America can go head-to-head with all of these countries. It will still be a big fish. The really difficult question is for a country like Britain and our other allies who benefited from living in that American-dominated world, how we're going to cope in a multipolar order, because actually the impacts on us are much more significant.
I think the really interesting question, I agree with all of that, is whether we can use the word order to describe what we're actually going to enter into. Because if it is an order where ostensibly the same structures are there, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization and things like that, but it's just slightly more China dominated and less US dominated. Does world carry on as normal, or actually do we enter a world where actually decisions are not taken collectively, but are decided essentially by the most powerful countries deciding what they want, and might is right? Because that might enter us into a world where it becomes acceptable for borders to be crossed and invaded, because that's what powerful countries do. It will become acceptable for human rights to be placed at a second order to economic development, which is essentially the Chinese sort of way of looking at it, thinking that actually what people really want is to become less poor, and that their individual personal rights is a sort of liberal and Western indulgence. And that might happen if this new world order comes into being. And so the question is, how do sort of medium-sized countries and weaker countries like the UK and others live in this new, uncertain, multipolar, less regulated order? Because occasionally you can find yourself on the wrong end of a tough decision. And I think that's going to be interesting. And the thing is, I don't know the answer to that question about, is that exactly what the new system that we will eventually end up in?
And we will get a little hint of what this new relationship looks like when Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping stand together. And that will be, James, really closely scrutinised, won't it? I mean, I presume we don't have any idea about what's going to happen, how that's going to look, what they're going to discuss at this stage. But it'll be interesting to see, won't it?
Yeah, simply because it'll be such an unusual sight to see these three men together in one place. But remember, as I said, Xi is the dominant character here. Russia is economically and politically dependent on a lot of what China does at the moment, particularly to fuel its war in Ukraine. Kim is just very keen to show that he has friends. This is a rare moment for him to leave his shores to do that. But remember that equally, China has been very vocal and clear in recent years about trying to avoid North Korea being too sort of expansionist and threatening with its nuclear power plays. Remember also that Xi in recent years has also been very sharp with Putin, sometimes face to face, whenever Putin has hinted that he might escalate using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. That has been very much shut down by the Chinese because they don't want that at all. So, yes, it'll be a moment of unity and smiles and handshakes, but there are still different elevations of power within that relationship. But yeah, if you think about it, three of the key players in the war in Ukraine. So from the West's point of view, you've got Kim Jong-un, who's providing soldiers. You've got China, which is providing economic succor to Russia, and then you've got Russia itself, the key protagonist in the war in Ukraine. All of them together. Remember the Iranians too. The president was, I don't know if he's actually going to the parade or not, but he was in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit. And Iran has been substantially influential in providing drones and other military equipment to Russia. So, to that extent, there is an alliance, a group of countries whose actual decisions, and not just appearances at summits, have a material impact on Western security right now on the battlefield.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It will be very interesting to watch, and we will be watching. James, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
And Sophia, lovely to hear from you. Thanks again.
Thanks so much.
Right, now we're going to talk about something that happens every year in Scotland, and it's a sort of macabre anniversary, to be honest with you, because this is the day when we have the annual drugs deaths figures released by the statisticians of the Scottish Government, and they make every year these days for grim reading. And we're going to talk about them with Chris Clements, my colleague, BBC Scotland's social affairs correspondent. Hi, Chris.
Hello.
Chris, before we get into the figures, it is odd, this, isn't it? We've talked about this before, that just the every year we come back to this place. It's a journalistic necessity to cover this, but it's sort of slightly weird and frustrating that it comes round every year and every year and every year, isn't it? It's just an odd journalistic experience.
It's one that I have no joy in covering, if I'm being honest with you. It is one of the diary stories that we cover once a year, every year, because of the nature of it, because it's been so high since 2018, because the number of deaths have been so high, and every time you're trying to think of new ways in which you can tell this in a way that's informative for an audience, rather than this being a sort of slow moving train wreck as it has been. It's a disaster for Scotland, but it's something that's happening at such a glacial pace over a long period of time, and you find yourself sort of struggling trying to find new ways of telling that story.
And that's not to say we only do it once a year, especially you. I mean, you're constantly reporting on the drug deaths crisis and what that means and why it's been happening, and we'll come on to some of that. But in terms of what we've just learned today, when you're saying it's been horrendous, particularly bad since 2018, and that's right, so from 2018 until last year, that we've just had the figures for 2024, Scotland has been the leading nation for drug deaths in Europe in every single one of those years. And we've got this year's figures now, don't we?
Well, yeah, so this year it's 1,017, which was a 13% drop on last year. And it's actually, about a 25% drop from the peak, which was in 2020 during COVID, which was 1,339. But you say 2018, but actually this sort of started around 2013 when the figures started going up and up. I think we had 7 years of year-on-year record drug death totals, and there wasn't a lot of reporting on it at the time. It wasn't until about 2019 when we were looking at the figures, and all of a sudden they were breaching 1,000 a year. And we all sort of we all sat up and went, hang on a minute, that's quite a lot for Scotland. We're quite a small country. And then that's when we started to realise that this was a huge issue that was underreported, and we started to sort of look at it.
Yeah, and you and I have talked a lot, haven't we, over the years about this, and tried to come up with theories, and you've had probably definitely better theories than me. But before we get into that, do you think that we in Scotland talk about this as a nation? I mean, is it something that comes up with family, with friends, when you're out reporting other stories? Or is it just something that, it makes big headline news in the UK once a year? What do you think?
That's interesting. I'm just trying to think if I ever discuss it with my parents. We certainly discuss alcohol quite a lot, but alcohol is very. I mean, we're a leading nation in that sort of respect.
In
as
Europe
well.
as well,
Yeah,
leading nation for alcohol deaths and
yeah.
drug deaths, which are not unconnected by any means.
I mean, it's the thing. I think it's become so much a, drug problems in society have become so familiar to most people in Scotland, and I'm not just in Scotland, and actually in the UK and probably Western Europe as well. It's everywhere that it almost becomes sort of part of the fabric of what's going on. So, for example, if I remember when I was a young journalist and I was going to cover court, sheriff court. I mean, half of the cases we were covering were involving somebody who had some form of drug problem, and you don't tend to. It didn't really factor into what you were thinking about at the time. It was just there. But it's when it got to the stage when you're looking at it and you're saying, well, hang on a second, Scotland has the highest drug death rate in Europe. It's like, there's a paper that came out written by Roy Robertson, among others, that was talking about it being comparable to the issues in North America. I mean, North America, you're talking about the opioid crisis in North America, and you're going, how has this happened? So that's when, as a journalist, we started to focus on it and say, I started to focus on it and go, well, let's try and understand how this has happened, how it's affecting normal people and the public.
It strikes me, Chris, that if you go all the way back to the 70s and 80s, that Scotland went through a period of enormous social, cultural and economic change. We had a period of deindustrialisation, the steel mills were closing, the famous towers at Ravenscraig,
That's where I'm from.
where you're from in
That's where I'm
Motherwell,
from,
came crashing down, emblematic of that change. The shipyards fell silent, the collieries were closing, and you get this generation of men, particularly men, who have a degree of hopelessness, a degree of trauma, a degree, joblessness, this family breakdown, and then a whole load of other things happen, and the slums are cleared, people are moved out into peripheral housing schemes in Scotland, and there's just an enormous disruptive degree of social change, isn't there, for quite a long period of time. And at that moment, or around that time, what about 1980, you start getting heroin coming into Scotland in big numbers. And these two forces, for me, I don't know if you agree with this, collide.
I think you mentioned all these post-industrial or industrial decline, that had a sort of hollowing out effect in a lot of poorer communities. It can lead to sort of aimlessness. But then heroin just ripped through poorer communities. So one of the biggest, one of the areas that it was most prevalent in was Muirhouse in Edinburgh. So that came in, it had a huge impact. There was at one stage we mentioned Roy Robertson actually. He was the guy that figured out, well, hang on, these guys all might have HIV, and that was a huge outbreak of HIV in Edinburgh, and that was all driven by injecting drug use. So that was all. So while that was happening in Edinburgh, heroin was making its way into other communities throughout Scotland, and it's never really went away, to be honest with you, James. It's still there. It might be degraded from what it was back then, and there might be other drugs that are in the mix now that are causing more problems. But it's the foundation that kind of started this whole issue that we are kind of dealing with now.
And many newscasters, when you talk about Muirhouse in Edinburgh, which I remember as a young reporter going into and being stunned, like really shocked by the conditions and the decay and the everything boarded up and abandoned needles. And this is the place that you're talking about when you think of Trainspotting, when you think of, perhaps the most famous portrayal, Irvine Welsh's novel and the film that followed, this portrayal of the disaster that was unfolding in Edinburgh. And obviously Trainspotting in some respects is a funny film, but in many respects is a very, very tragic film as well. But that was really happening. I mean, Irvine Welsh's, it was rooted in experience of what was happening in the city at the time.
Yeah, and I mean, Trainspotting came out in 1996, so you're talking about 10 years after it all took place. I mean, I wasn't around, so I can't really tell you.
Well, I'm so old, Chris. Yeah. I remember reading the novel 3 years before that, I think.
Right. So, but I mean, these issues persisted throughout the 90s. You had issues with jellies that came in the 90s. They were like temazepam and things like that. That augmented what was already going on. Trainspotting came out in 1996. Coincidentally, that's when our drug death stats actually began. That's where we started keeping a tally on when how many people were actually dying as a result of this lifestyle.
And you and I have been speaking to various people this week, and one of the people I've been speaking to who's very familiar to you is a woman called Anne-Marie Ward, and she's from a charity, Faces and Voices of Recovery UK. She's been pretty critical of the Scottish Government and its approach in some regards, but I thought it was interesting what she was telling me about that culture that we have here in Scotland.
What we're talking about here is a penchant for oblivion, and culturally we certainly have that.
So you're saying that there's something in Scotland and the Scottish psyche, it's a tendency towards oblivion?
I think it's cultural in that it's become normalised and that we've just accepted that it's normal, and I don't think we have to accept that normality.
And that's not the first time Anne-Marie said that. Chris, you've heard her say penchant for oblivion before. It's a very striking phrase.
She has said it before on our programme. Anne-Marie's actually been one of the kind of main voices critical of the Scottish Government's handling of this, who out with the political sphere, if you like. So yeah, she's a big advocate for things like rehab and recovery. So she has been really at the forefront of campaigning to try and get more attention on this. And this is going back to, we mentioned 2019 and people taking notice. That was going back as far as that, and probably earlier for her. But yeah, I can remember I've been speaking to her since 2019 at least, I think.
Yeah, and she actually has experienced this herself, and I had a long chat with her about whether she was happy to tell this story, but she says she is, that she was drinking alcohol at 11, she was taking heroin as a teenager, and she talks about, the damage that does and the trauma. And another person I've been speaking to about that, Chris, is Dr. Susanna Galea Singer, and she's from the Faculty of Addictions at the Royal College of Psychiatrists Scotland, which is a very long title. It's one of these titles you can't fit on the TV when you're putting a report on the television. But I thought she was interesting, talking about how, when we're starting with heroin and the 80s and so on, and the deindustrialisation, about how those effects cascade down the generations and what that means for families, and maybe why some drug use within families that have seen it before continues.
We practically know that every person who seeks treatment has been traumatized in some way. So you get social fragmentation when you have aspects of poverty, aspects of trauma. You burn bridges with families. It's just extremely difficult. So yeah, it does fragment society.
So that fragmentation of society she's talking about there, that gives us some explanation, and so does the heroin and the train spotting landscape. Then we have this really big spike in deaths around, about a decade ago, more or less. And there are two big factors there, aren't they? And you, Chris, you made a documentary about that. You're much better describing them than me, because you made a whole documentary about what happened. Tell me what those two things are.
So we mentioned before about the post-industrial landscape that we were dealing with. We mentioned about people who have been living that lifestyle for a long period of time. So that was sort of foundation of everything. Services were really poor at that time, so I think it was 40% of problem drug users in Scotland were in treatment. Compare that to England, which was at 60%, higher on the continent. So all that was happening at the same time. Round about 2012, right? Okay, remember Legal Highs? But Legal Highs was a thing that the media was obsessed with in the late 2000s, early 2010s, because there were drugs that were coming out, new substances that were mimicking the effects of old substances like cocaine, speed. We were all talking about them. David Cameron's government was talking about them. It led to the new Psychoactive Substances Act of 2015, all the rest of it. We were all focusing on the party drugs. What was actually happening was drug gangs had figured out that they could take similar substances, particularly one called a Tizolam, which is a benzodiazepine substitute, which is manufactured in China, prescribed in places like Japan and India. They take that, they use that, press it in garages, in lockups, to mimic the look of a legitimate Valium tablet or a Xanax tablet, and they can sell these in the street for 30 pence a pop. So around about 2012, 2013, a Tizolam started to hit the streets after the wave of the Legal Highs. You started to see more and more people taking these. They called them the blue plague at the time. That's what the tabloid were calling them, because more and more people were taking these and dying.
Little blue pills.
Little blue pills. It went from Islam having not been anywhere on the scene whatsoever. And by the way, these are people who were already addicted to heroin and taking benzodiazepines to top them up. It went from having one death in 2012 to, by the height of the drug death crisis, it was over 800 deaths involving Atisalam. And how that would work would be people would be already on heroin, they would possibly be taking a methadone prescription, potentially drinking alcohol. All these things have the same effect on your central nervous system. It slows your breathing down. These tablets, which it was quite a unique phenomenon in Scotland actually, these street Valium tablets as we became to know them, people would take loads and loads of these, dozens and dozens of these at a time on top of that, and all of these things had the same effect of slowing your breathing down until it stopped. And that's how the drug death crisis was supercharged, if you like, by that and by the introduction of those drugs.
And I think you've said a really important thing there, which is that was particularly the case in Scotland. We had in this country a lot more of that than in other parts of the UK and other parts of the world. And at the same time, there's a second factor that you've also talked about, and in the documentary you made, you talk about it, and that were the cuts to funding.
Yeah.
So in about, 2015-16, the Scottish Government cuts funding for local drug services, and that sort of disastrously coincides with the rise in these drugs.
It's at the same time this is happening. It's the same time the figures were going like this at this point. They cut the funding. I think it was by a fifth. I think it was over 20%, and that had a big impact on the amount of people that ADPs that were already alcohol drug partnerships that were already struggling to reach people. As I said before, only 40% of people were in treatment. All of a sudden, they found they were having to cut back, and in the meantime, the graph that we were looking at was doing that. So, as I say, at the time, the media wasn't necessarily focused on this. We weren't really understanding what was happening under our noses. It wasn't until about 2 years later that we began to realise that something is going on here that's different from other times, it's different from other places. And it was, I believe it was driven by, one, the introduction of street Valium, just look at the figures, and two, the inability of services to deal with the influx of these new drugs.
Which makes a lot of sense. And Kirsten Horsburgh, who's the chief executive of a charity called the Scottish Drugs Forum, has spoken to us about what she sees as a pretty disastrous effect of that.
Cuts to funding in this area is a disaster. Like, we can't just have small pilots of projects to address a public health emergency. We would not do that for any other public health emergency. We did not do that for COVID. We should not be doing that for the drug deaths crisis.
Now, the Scottish Government, in fairness to them, Chris, are saying we've invested a lot of money in this recently. There's been a thing called a 5-year national mission to try to get to grips with this crisis. They're saying that they're pleased that progress has been made this year, but that more progress still has to come. And in terms of that national mission, they've done various things, and one of them's this consumption room in Glasgow, which is, tell us, you've been in there a lot. What is that?
I'll just mention National Mission first of all, because that's £250 million extra funding. That ends in May. So what they're looking at is they're increasing residential rehab. They haven't hit their targets on that yet, but a lot of people who are providing that are a bit worried about where the funding's going to come from if the funding just suddenly stops at the end of the mission in May. So yeah, the consumption room, we call it the Thistle. It's in the East End of Glasgow. Now that was initially, 2015 is a really key year, by the way, because this is when all these things were happening. That was initially in response to an HIV outbreak, the worst since the 80s, that happened among injecting drug users in Glasgow in 2015. Now, it was initially proposed in 2017. There was a big back and forth about whether or not it should go ahead because they wanted to target that population and reduce the harms of blood-borne viruses like HIV. It never went ahead. The Lord Advocate wouldn't give it permission. The Home Office wouldn't give it permission. After the drug death crisis became a political issue, it was sort of then revived and then came back in the guise of in part of the tackling drug deaths. But its aims remain the same. It's to target that tiny population of people in the East End of Glasgow. It's controversial because obviously it's allowing people to inject drugs like heroin, like cocaine, under supervision by NHS staff. We've never had that before in the UK. We've seen it in other countries. We've never had it before in the UK. It's controversial locally as well because people, in respect of many other issues that we talk about today, people are looking at that and saying, well, why are this group of people getting money whereas I can't get a GP's appointment and things like that? But as we spent about a year following that through, we spent 2 days working in it, and it's quite a controversial and innovative facility.
Yeah. So now, looking at where we are now, there has been some improvement, but we're still talking 1,000 people dying a year. I mean, it's hardly a
It's
triumph.
1 year.
Yeah, exactly. We also have concerns about the prevalence of this new synthetic opioid class called nitazines, which are cut into drugs that you don't buy nitazines, they're adulterated into other things. And there's a bit of an alarm that that might push the figures up again next year. So the point is, we're not out of the woods. But my question to you, Chris, is this. Why is this not, and if you agree with me that it's not, why is this not number one on the political agenda in Scotland? Is it even significantly on the political agenda? You know, we're going to election period, the Holyrood elections, Scottish parliamentary elections next year. Do you think this figures in people's voting intentions?
I think you're better off asking me why it wasn't on the political agenda earlier. Because ultimately, why wasn't it? Because the people who needed those services and were using them don't vote. Ultimately, they don't vote. So if there is no use in talking to that group of people, they're not asking for anything, then it's not going to become a priority. Bear in mind, this was at the time we were talking about, well, the independence referendum was earlier than that, just slightly earlier than that. We had Brexit. So there was all this back and forth on this kind of thing.
Yeah, there was a lot of political focus on other things.
Yeah, but all this stuff was all happening under our noses.
It's partly on us as well.
It is on us. Will it be on the agenda of the man in the street? I think there's still a lot of stigma around people who use drugs. I think that there's been inroads in the way that the media actually deal with it to a certain degree. And kind of trying to have a bit more compassion and understanding about this. It's certainly some of the language that was being used even just like 10, 15 years ago is not around as much. I think if you were to ask a man in the street whether or not that is going to be his main priority, the answer is probably no.
I really, really hope we're not back here in a year's time, but we're just going to be, aren't we?
It's just, I mean, we're talking about 10,000 people over the course of over a decade. It's 1,000 people a year. I mean, you were mentioning earlier about this thing about the families and things like that. I have seen it in my reporting, going through different families. You know, there was one person 5-6 years ago we dealt with. She was the last surviving member of her family. And it was, you know, her mother, her father, her 2 sisters and her brother, all gone for drugs. And that was happening right in front of us. So I'm hoping eventually we won't have to talk about this as much, but I don't think that's going to be for quite some time.
Thanks, Chris.
No problem.